Marcus Thompson stood perfectly still at his post outside Buckingham Palace, his red tunic immaculate, and his tall black bearskin hat casting a shadow over his weathered face. Tourists gathered around him trying to make him laugh or move, but Marcus remained motionless like a statue. What they didn't know was that behind his stoic expression, he was fighting memories that haunted him every single day. The other guards called him Silent Stone behind his back. They thought he was just another quiet soldier who took the ceremonial duties too seriously. During their breaks, while others shared jokes and stories from their military service, Marcus would sit alone, polishing his rifle or staring into the distance. His fellow guards assumed he had never seen real combat, that he was just a palace decoration who had never fired a shot in anger. Lieutenant James Morrison, the youngest of the royal guards, was particularly cruel in his mockery. He would whisper to the others about how Marcus probably joined the guards to avoid real military service. The other soldiers would snicker when Marcus walked by, making comments about how some people were born to stand still and look pretty for tourists. They had no idea that the man they mocked had once been considered one of the most dangerous soldiers in the British military. Marcus had learned long ago that silence was his shield. He had tried to fit in when he first arrived at the palace 2 years ago, but every time he started to open up, the nightmares would return, the sound of gunfire in his dreams, the faces of enemies he had eliminated from impossible distances, the weight of missions that could never be spoken about. So he chose silence, letting his fellow guards believe whatever they wanted about him. The truth was that Marcus Thompson had spent 8 years with the Special Air Service, the elite SAS regiment that most soldiers only dreamed of joining. He had been deployed to Afghanistan, Iraq, and several other locations that didn't officially exist on any mission reports. His specialty was long-range precision shooting, and he had earned a reputation among his SAS brothers as someone who never missed when it mattered most. But those days felt like a lifetime ago. After his last mission went terribly wrong, resulting in the loss of his entire team except for him, Marcus had requested a transfer to the most peaceful posting he could find. The Royal Guards seemed like the perfect place to disappear, to serve his country without having to take another life. He thought the ceremony and tradition would help him heal, but instead he found himself more isolated than ever. Every morning, Marcus would wake up at dawn and prepare his uniform with military precision. He would inspect every button, every crease, every piece of equipment as if his life depended on it, because once it had. The habits of a Special Forces soldier never truly fade, even when wearing a ceremonial red coat instead of combat gear. The other guards saw this attention to detail as obsessive behavior, not recognizing it as the mark of a professional warrior. The tourists loved taking pictures with the stoic guard who never moved or smiled. Children would wave at him and Marcus would feel a small warmth in his heart, remembering why he had originally joined the military, to protect people like these families, to ensure they could live in peace and safety. But then a car would backfire nearby, or a tourist would drop something loud, and Marcus would have to fight every instinct that told him to drop to the ground and scan for threats. His commanding officer, Colonel Richards, had tried several times to engage Marcus in conversation, sensing there was more to the quiet guard than met the eye. But Marcus had become expert at deflecting questions about his past, giving just enough information to satisfy curiosity without revealing the classified truth. He claimed to have served in logistics, a boring enough assignment that people rarely asked follow-up questions. The palace grounds were Marcus's new battlefield, but instead of eliminating enemies, he was protecting tradition and ceremony. He took pride in his role, even if others didn't understand it. Every day he stood guard was another day he wasn't holding a sniper rifle, another day he could try to forget the precision with which he had once ended lives from distances that seemed impossible to most soldiers. What his fellow guards didn't realize was that Marcus was constantly assessing threats, even during the most routine ceremonial duties. His trained eyes would sweep the crowds, identifying potential dangers and calculating angles and distances out of pure habit. The skills that had made him legendary in the SAS were still sharp, hidden beneath the facade of a simple palace guard. As the months passed, Marcus began to hope that maybe he could build a new life in this role. Maybe the mockery and isolation were worth it if it meant he could serve without violence. Maybe he could find peace in the routine and ceremony, even if he had to endure the quiet laughter and whispered comments of his colleagues. But peace, as Marcus would soon learn, was not something that lasted long in his world. The skills that he had tried so hard to bury were about to become the only thing standing between innocent lives and a threat that no one else could handle. The silent guard who had been mocked and dismissed was about to prove that some soldiers never truly retire from the war, no matter how hard they try to leave it behind. The morning started like any other for Marcus Thompson. He stood at his assigned position near the palace gates, watching the steady stream of tourists gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. The autumn air was crisp, and the fallen leaves crunched under the feet of visitors who posed for photographs and chatted excitedly about seeing the famous royal guards up close. Lieutenant Morrison and the other guards were in particularly good spirits that day, having heard rumors about a special ceremony planned for the following week. During their brief break, Morrison had made another joke about Marcus being a human statue, suggesting that maybe the palace should just replace him with an actual stone figure since no one would notice the difference. The other guards laughed, but Marcus remained focused on his duties, scanning the crowd with the trained eyes of a former Special Forces operator. Something felt different today, though Marcus couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. There were the usual tourists, families with children, elderly couples taking photographs, and groups of young people on holiday. But scattered among them were individuals who didn't quite fit the pattern. Men who moved with too much purpose, who seemed more interested in studying the palace layout than taking pictures, who kept checking their watches as if waiting for a specific time. Marcus's SAS training kicked in automatically. He began mentally cataloging these suspicious individuals, noting their positions, clothing, and behavior patterns. There was a man in a blue jacket near the fountain who had been pretending to read a newspaper for the past 20 minutes but hadn't turned a single page. Another individual in dark clothing had walked past the same section of fence 3 times, each time stopping to tie his shoe at the exact same spot. The worst part was that Marcus couldn't share his concerns with anyone. His fellow guards already thought he was strange and paranoid. If he started talking about suspicious behavior in the crowd, they would probably assume he was having some kind of mental breakdown. Colonel Richards might even decide that Marcus was unfit for duty and transfer him elsewhere. As the morning progressed, Marcus noticed more troubling signs. Several of the suspicious individuals were wearing earpieces, barely visible but definitely there for someone trained to spot such things. They were also carrying bags that seemed heavier than they should be for typical tourist gear. Most concerning, of all, they were positioning themselves at strategic points around the palace perimeter, creating what looked like a coordinated surveillance network. During the midday break, Marcus tried to casually mention his observations to Sergeant Davies, one of the more experienced guards. He suggested that maybe they should alert the police about some unusual activity in the crowd. But Davies just laughed and told Marcus that he was overthinking things, that tourists always acted strange when they were excited about seeing the palace. The sergeant patted Marcus on the shoulder and advised him to relax, saying that the most dangerous thing they usually faced was aggressive photographers trying to get the perfect shot. Marcus felt the familiar frustration of being dismissed, but this time it wasn't just about his feelings. His instincts were screaming that something dangerous was developing, and no one would listen. He had learned to trust these instincts during his years with the SAS, where the ability to sense threats before they materialized was often the difference between life and death for his entire team. As the afternoon shift began, Marcus positioned himself where he could maintain visual contact with as many of the suspicious individuals as possible. He noticed that they were all using similar communication devices and seemed to be following some kind of coordinated timeline. At exactly 2 o'clock, several of them moved to new positions, creating what appeared to be overlapping fields of observation around the palace. The changing of the guard ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock, which would bring hundreds of additional tourists to the area. If something was going to happen, Marcus realized, it would likely be during that chaos when security forces would be stretched thin and distracted by crowd control. The thought of innocent families and children being caught in whatever these men were planning made his stomach tighten with familiar dread. Marcus began running through tactical scenarios in his mind, calculating distances and angles, identifying potential cover positions and escape routes. These were skills he had hoped never to use again, but now they might be the only thing that could prevent a disaster. He found himself unconsciously checking his ceremonial rifle, even though he knew it wasn't loaded and wouldn't be much use against whatever weapons these potential threats might be carrying. The most frustrating part was the isolation. Marcus had always worked as part of a team during his SAS days, with brothers who trusted his judgment and would act on his intelligence without question. Now he was surrounded by fellow soldiers who saw him as a quiet oddity, not a trained warrior whose instincts had kept him alive through some of the most dangerous missions in British military history. As 3 o'clock approached, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't stand by and watch innocent people get hurt just because his colleagues didn't believe him. If something was going to happen during the ceremony, he needed to be ready to act, even if it meant revealing the skills and training he had worked so hard to hide. The quiet guard who had been mocked and dismissed was about to step back into the role he had never truly left behind. Marcus Thompson, the man who had once been known in SAS circles as the Ghost for his ability to eliminate targets from impossible distances, was preparing to protect the palace and its visitors in ways that no one could imagine. The ceremony was about to begin, and Marcus knew that the next hour would determine whether his peaceful exile was over forever. The skills that had made him legendary were stirring back to life, and the silent guard was ready to show everyone exactly who he really was. At 3:30, Marcus made a decision that went against every protocol in the Royal Guard handbook. He broke formation and walked directly to the security office, knowing that his absence from his post would be noticed and reported. But the suspicious activity in the crowd had reached a critical point, and he could no longer stand by and hope that someone else would notice what he was seeing. The security office was staffed by Inspector Sarah Chen, a sharp-eyed police officer who had been assigned to palace security for the past 5 years. She looked up in surprise when Marcus entered, since the ceremonial guards rarely had reason to visit the security station during their shifts. She could see the tension in his posture, the way his eyes kept darting to the monitors showing camera feeds from around the palace grounds. Marcus struggled with how to explain his concerns without revealing his true background. He told Inspector Chen that he had noticed several individuals in the crowd who seemed to be conducting surveillance rather than sightseeing. He pointed out the man with the newspaper who hadn't moved from his position in over an hour, and the group of men who seemed to be communicating through hand signals rather than speaking to each other. Inspector Chen was initially skeptical, as most reports from the ceremonial guards involved complaints about rude tourists or concerns about crowd size. But something in Marcus's tone and the specific details he provided made her take a closer look at the security monitors. She began pulling up different camera angles, focusing on the individuals Marcus had identified, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The men Marcus had spotted were indeed acting in a coordinated manner that was completely inconsistent with normal tourist behavior. Even more concerning, when Inspector Chen ran facial recognition software on the clearest images, 2 of the individuals came back with matches to known associates of international terrorist organizations. The system flagged them as persons of interest who should have been detained on site. Inspector Chen immediately activated the palace's emergency protocols, sending alerts to all security personnel and requesting immediate backup from Scotland Yard's anti-terrorism unit. She also ordered the postponement of the changing of the guard ceremony, but it was too late. The ceremony was already beginning, and hundreds of tourists were packed into the courtyard, making evacuation nearly impossible without causing a panic that could lead to injuries or worse. Marcus watched the monitors as the suspected terrorists moved into final positions around the crowd. His military experience told him that they were setting up for a coordinated attack that would maximize casualties and create chaos. The positioning was too professional, too precise to be anything other than a well-planned operation by people with serious training and resources. Inspector Chen was coordinating with incoming backup units when the first shots rang out. The sound of automatic gunfire echoed across the palace courtyard, and the camera feeds showed tourists screaming and running in all directions as armed men emerged from the crowd and began firing indiscriminately. The worst fears of both Marcus and Inspector Chen were coming true, and innocent people were dying while the response teams were still minutes away. Marcus felt something snap inside him, a switch that had been carefully kept in the off position for 2 years. The peaceful palace guard disappeared, and in his place, stood the SAS operative, who had once been considered one of the most lethal soldiers in the British military. Without waiting for permission or orders, he grabbed his ceremonial rifle and headed for the door. Inspector Chen tried to stop him, pointing out that his rifle wasn't loaded and that he wasn't trained for this kind of situation. But Marcus was already moving with the fluid efficiency of a special forces operator. His entire demeanor transformed from the quiet, still guard she had known into something altogether more dangerous and purposeful. Marcus ran through the palace corridors with the muscle memory of countless training exercises and real missions. He knew exactly where the weapons storage was located, and he knew that his security clearance, though limited, would still get him access to the ammunition that could turn his ceremonial rifle into a functional weapon. The keypad responded to his code, and within seconds he was loading live rounds into the weapon he carried every day, but had never expected to use. From his position inside the palace, Marcus could hear the ongoing gunfire and the screams of terrified civilians. Each second of delay meant more innocent lives lost, more families destroyed by the violence that he had the skills to stop. The guilt of his past missions, the weight of all the lives he had taken, suddenly seemed less important than the lives he could save right now. Marcus made his way to the upper floors of the palace, where he knew he could get a clear view of the courtyard and the surrounding areas. His training kicked in automatically as he assessed angles, wind conditions, and distances. The familiar weight of a loaded rifle in his hands felt both comforting and terrifying, like greeting an old friend who had led him down a dark path. Through the palace windows, Marcus could see the chaos unfolding below. At least 6 armed attackers were moving through the crowd, firing at anyone who tried to run or fight back. The royal guards on duty were trying to respond, but they were equipped for ceremony, not combat, and several had already been wounded or killed in the initial assault. The quiet guard who had been mocked and dismissed was gone forever. In his place stood Marcus Thompson, the SAS sniper known as the Ghost, and he was about to remind the world why that nickname had once struck fear into the hearts of Britain's enemies. The peaceful exile was over, and the war had followed him home to the place where he had hoped to find redemption. Marcus steadied his rifle and began to acquire his first target, knowing that each shot would take him further away from the peaceful life he had tried to build, but closer to saving the innocent people who were depending on skills they didn't even know he possessed. Marcus positioned himself at a window on the 3rd floor of the palace, a location that gave him an elevated view of the entire courtyard where the attack was unfolding. Through his rifle scope, he could see the terrorists moving with military precision, using suppressive fire to keep the royal guards pinned down, while methodically targeting civilians who were trying to escape. The first target was a man in dark clothing who had positioned himself near the main gate, cutting off the primary escape route for hundreds of terrified tourists. Marcus calculated the distance at approximately 250 meters, with a slight crosswind from the east. These were the kinds of calculations that had once been as natural to him as breathing, mathematical equations written in the language of life and death. Marcus controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate through techniques learned during years of SAS training. The familiar ritual of preparing for a precision shot brought back memories of missions in hostile territories, of eliminating threats from distances that seemed impossible to ordinary soldiers. His finger found the trigger, and for a moment, time seemed suspended as he made the final adjustments for wind and distance. The rifle kicked against his shoulder with a sharp crack that was barely audible over the chaos below. Through his scope, Marcus watched the terrorist by the gate stumble and fall, his weapon clattering across the pavement as tourists rushed past him toward safety. It was a clean shot, precise and immediate, exactly the kind of work that had made Marcus legendary among his SAS brothers. But there was no time to reflect on the shot or the man whose life he had just ended. 5 more terrorists were still active in the courtyard, and innocent people were dying while Marcus hesitated. He shifted his position, acquiring a new target who was advancing on a group of children huddled behind an overturned vendor cart. The second shot was more challenging, as the target was moving and partially concealed behind concrete barriers. Marcus led the target slightly, accounting for the man's speed and direction, then squeezed the trigger with the same mechanical precision that had once made him the most feared sniper in British Special Forces. The bullet found its mark, and another threat was neutralized before he could harm the children. From his elevated position, Marcus could see patterns in the attack that the ground-level responders couldn't perceive. The terrorists were working in coordinated pairs, using communication equipment to coordinate their movements and maintain control over different sections of the courtyard. They weren't just random killers. They were professionals executing a carefully planned operation. Marcus shifted targets again, focusing on a terrorist who had taken position behind a stone pillar and was using it as cover to fire on the royal guards, who were trying to organize a response. This shot required threading the needle between civilians and hitting a target that was only partially exposed, the kind of precision work that separated elite snipers from ordinary marksmen. The third shot silenced the terrorist's weapon permanently, but it also revealed Marcus's position to the remaining attackers. He could see muzzle flashes turning in his direction. As the surviving terrorist realized they were being engaged by a sniper from inside the palace, bullets began striking the window frame around him, sending glass and stone fragments flying through the air. Marcus rolled away from the window, moving to a new position with the fluid efficiency of someone who had been shot at many times before. The terrorists below were good, but they weren't SAS trained, and they were making mistakes that Marcus could exploit. They were focusing too much attention on his last known position, instead of anticipating where he might move next. From a window 20 meters down the corridor, Marcus re-engaged with his fourth target, a terrorist who was trying to reach a group of tourists trapped near the palace steps. The shot was taken at a severe angle, requiring Marcus to compensate for both distance and the downward trajectory. But his bullet found its mark with the same deadly accuracy that had made him a legend. The remaining two terrorists were now fully aware that they were being hunted by a sniper, and they began using more sophisticated tactics to avoid his fire. They moved in short rushes between cover points, used smoke grenades to obscure his vision, and tried to coordinate their movements to make it difficult for him to engage both simultaneously. But Marcus had faced trained opponents before, soldiers and insurgents who knew how to fight snipers and had been taught the same counter-sniper techniques that these terrorists were using. He began to anticipate their movements, to think several steps ahead of their tactical decisions, drawing on years of experience in asymmetric warfare where being predictable meant being dead. The fifth target made the mistake of assuming that Marcus would stay in the same general area of the palace. Instead, Marcus had moved to an entirely different wing, approaching from an angle that the terrorist hadn't anticipated. When the man emerged from cover to engage what he thought was Marcus's position, he exposed himself to a shot from a completely different direction. Marcus's bullet ended the threat immediately, leaving only one terrorist active in the courtyard. But this last man was the most dangerous, clearly the leader of the group and someone with enough training to recognize that he was facing a professional sniper. Instead of panicking or making desperate moves, he began working systematically toward the palace entrance, using civilians as human shields and making shots nearly impossible. Marcus realized that a conventional sniper engagement wasn't going to work against this final opponent. The man was too smart, too well-trained, and too willing to use innocent people as protection. If Marcus was going to stop him, it would require leaving his sniper's perch and engaging in close-quarters combat, using skills that went far beyond marksmanship. The quiet royal guard who had stood motionless for 2 years was about to become a different kind of warrior entirely. Marcus Thompson was preparing to leave his elevated position and hunt down the last terrorist face to face, using the full range of deadly skills that had made him one of the most feared operators in SAS history. Marcus left his sniper position and moved through the palace corridors with the silent efficiency of a predator, stalking dangerous prey. The last terrorist had made it inside the building, dragging 2 hostages with him and calling out demands in accented English. Through the palace's internal communication system, Marcus could hear the man threatening to kill the civilians unless he was given safe passage out of the country. The terrorist had chosen his hostages strategically, an elderly woman and a young girl, probably a grandmother and granddaughter, who had come to see the changing of the guard. Their terror was audible in their sobbing, and Marcus knew that this man wouldn't hesitate to kill them if he felt cornered or threatened. This wasn't just about stopping a terrorist anymore. It was about saving 2 innocent lives while eliminating a trained killer. Marcus moved through the palace like a ghost, using service corridors and maintenance passages that most of the guards didn't even know existed. His SAS training had included extensive work in urban environments, learning to navigate buildings silently and approach targets without being detected. The ornate halls of Buckingham Palace were just another battlefield, and Marcus knew how to use every shadow and corner to his advantage. Through his earpiece, Marcus could hear Inspector Chen coordinating with the police negotiator, who was trying to establish communication with the terrorist. The man was demanding a helicopter, safe passage to an airport, and the release of several prisoners held in British facilities. His demands were becoming more erratic and desperate, which meant the situation was becoming more dangerous for the hostages. Marcus reached a position where he could observe the terrorist through a partially open door. The man was holding the elderly woman in front of him as a human shield, with his weapon pressed against her temple, while the young girl cowered nearby. He was positioned in the throne room, a location that gave him good fields of fire in multiple directions, but also limited his escape routes. The terrorist was professional enough to keep moving, never staying in one position long enough for a sniper to get a clean shot. But Marcus noticed that every few minutes when the man checked his watch or looked toward the windows, he would shift his grip on the hostage slightly. Those moments of distraction lasted only seconds, but for someone with Marcus's training, seconds could be enough. Marcus began working his way closer, using the throne room's elaborate decorations and furniture as concealment. Each movement was calculated and deliberate, drawing on skills that had kept him alive during some of the most dangerous missions in SAS history. He was getting close enough that firearms would be less useful than the close-quarters combat techniques that had been drilled into him during years of Special Forces training. Terrorists' radio crackled with transmissions in a language Marcus didn't recognize, but the tone suggested that backup wasn't coming. The man's 5 companions were dead. The police had surrounded the palace, and his escape routes were being systematically closed off. This was when cornered terrorists became most dangerous, when they had nothing left to lose and might decide to take as many innocent lives with them as possible. Marcus reached a position where he was less than 10 meters from the terrorist, concealed behind an ornate pillar that had probably witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies. From here he could hear the man's breathing, could see the sweat on his face, could calculate exactly how long it would take to close the distance between them. But the hostages complicated everything. The elderly woman was weak and terrified, barely able to stand under her own power. The young girl was in shock, her eyes wide with terror as she pressed herself against the wall. Any aggressive action by Marcus would put both of them at immediate risk, and even with his training, there was no guarantee he could eliminate the terrorist before the man could harm one or both hostages. Marcus activated his radio, speaking quietly to Inspector Chen and identifying himself by his real rank and unit for the first time in 2 years. He provided a tactical assessment of the situation and requested that the negotiator keep the terrorist talking for exactly 3 more minutes. He needed that time to position himself for an approach that would neutralize the threat while minimizing risk to the civilians. Inspector Chen's voice came back over the radio, filled with surprise and confusion. She had run Marcus's real military record after his earlier warning about the terrorists, and now she understood why his instincts had been so accurate. The quiet royal guard she had known was actually a decorated SAS operative with more combat experience than most of the tactical officers surrounding the palace. Marcus began his final approach, moving with the patient precision of a hunter who had tracked dangerous prey across multiple continents. Every step was planned and executed with the knowledge that a single mistake would result in the death of innocent people. The terrorist was still focused on the negotiations, still believing that his hostages gave him leverage and protection. The man made his fatal error when he turned slightly to look out a window, checking for signs of the helicopter he had demanded. For just a moment, his attention shifted away from his immediate surroundings and his grip on the elderly woman loosened slightly. It was the opening Marcus had been waiting for, the split-second opportunity that separated professional operators from amateurs. Marcus moved with explosive speed, covering the distance between them in a blur of motion that the terrorist never saw coming. Years of SAS training compressed into a single moment of perfectly executed violence, designed to end the threat instantly while protecting the innocent lives that hung in the balance. The throne room, which had hosted countless royal ceremonies and state functions, was about to witness the kind of lethal efficiency that made the SAS legendary. Marcus Thompson, the quiet guard who had been mocked and dismissed, was revealing exactly why he had once been considered one of the most dangerous soldiers in the British military. Marcus struck with the precision of a surgical instrument and the speed of lightning, his left arm wrapped around the terrorist's weapon, controlling the gun's direction while his right hand delivered a devastating blow to the man's throat that cut off any chance of a scream or warning. The entire engagement lasted less than 3 seconds, and the terrorist was unconscious before his body hit the ornate carpet of the throne room. The elderly woman collapsed to her knees, sobbing with relief while the young girl ran to her grandmother's arms. Marcus immediately checked both hostages for injuries, his demeanor switching from deadly operator to protective guardian in an instant. His voice was gentle and reassuring as he told them they were safe, that the danger was over, and that medical personnel would be with them shortly. Inspector Chen and the tactical response team burst into the throne room moments later, weapons drawn and ready for a firefight, only to find Marcus kneeling beside the hostages and the terrorists zip-tied with improvised restraints. The contrast was stark. The quiet guard they had known was gone, replaced by someone who moved and spoke with the confident authority of a seasoned Special Forces operator. The aftermath was swift and professional. Paramedics attended to the hostages while bomb disposal experts swept the palace for any devices the terrorists might have planted. The surviving terrorist was taken into custody, still unconscious from Marcus's precisely applied force. In less than an hour, what could have been a national tragedy had been resolved with minimal casualties and maximum efficiency. Colonel Richards arrived at the scene with a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. He had commanded the Royal Guards for 15 years, but he had never seen anything like what Marcus had just accomplished. As the reports came in about the sniper fire that had eliminated 5 terrorists with perfect accuracy, followed by the hand-to-hand combat that had saved the hostages, the colonel began to understand that his quiet guard was something far more extraordinary than anyone had imagined. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. News crews surrounded the palace reporting on the terrorist attack and the mysterious guard who had single-handedly prevented a massacre. But Marcus had already disappeared from the scene, slipping away during the chaos of the emergency response. With the same stealth that had made him legendary in the SAS, Lieutenant Morrison and the other guards who had mocked Marcus were forced to confront the reality of who they had been serving alongside. The man they had called Silent Stone and dismissed as a human statue had just demonstrated skills that most soldiers could only dream of possessing. Their jokes about his lack of combat experience now seemed not just wrong, but embarrassingly ignorant. Inspector Chen found Marcus later that evening, sitting alone in the palace gardens and staring at the spot where tourists had been enjoying a peaceful ceremony just hours earlier. She sat beside him without speaking, understanding that someone who had just been forced back into the world of violence might need time to process what had happened. Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had hoped never to take another life, but had been forced to do exactly that. He told Inspector Chen about his SAS service, about the missions that couldn't be discussed and the toll that years of precision killing had taken on his soul. He explained that he had requested the Royal Guard position as a way to serve his country, without having to use the deadly skills that had defined his military career. Inspector Chen listened without judgment, recognizing the pain of a warrior who had tried to find peace but had been pulled back into war by circumstances beyond his control. She understood that Marcus had saved countless lives that day, but she also saw that each bullet he had fired had cost him a piece of the redemption he had been seeking. The official reports would credit the successful resolution of the terrorist attack to outstanding coordination between the Royal Guards, palace security, and police tactical units. Marcus's role would be described in vague terms that protected his identity and his past, allowing him to fade back into the shadows if he chose to do so. But among the intelligence community and special forces units, word spread quickly about the Royal Guard who had eliminated 6 terrorists with the kind of precision and efficiency that marked him as one of the elite. The name Marcus Thompson began appearing in classified briefings, and offers started arriving for assignments that would put his skills to use in ways that the ceremonial duties of a palace guard never could. The question now facing Marcus was whether he could return to the quiet life he had built, knowing that his cover was blown, and his reputation as a deadly operator was spreading through military circles. The peaceful exile that had lasted 2 years was over, and he would have to decide whether to embrace the warrior he had always been, or fight to maintain the facade of the simple guard he had tried to become. The tourists would return to the palace within days, eager to see the guards and hear the stories of the day when one of them had saved so many lives. But Marcus knew that he could never again stand motionless and silent, pretending to be nothing more than a ceremonial soldier. The ghost of his SAS past had been awakened, and it would be much harder to put back to sleep this time. 3 weeks after the attack, Marcus stood once again at his post outside Buckingham Palace, but everything had changed. The tourists who gathered around him now looked at him with a mixture of awe and curiosity, many having seen the news reports about the guard who had stopped the terrorists. Children pointed at him with excitement, and their parents spoke in hushed tones about the hero who had saved so many lives. His fellow guards treated him with a respect that bordered on reverence. Lieutenant Morrison had personally apologized for his past mockery, admitting that he felt ashamed for having judged someone whose service record was far more distinguished than anything he had accomplished. The jokes and whispered comments had been replaced by genuine admiration and a desire to learn from someone who had proven himself under the most extreme circumstances. Colonel Richards had offered Marcus several options for his future. He could return to active SAS duty, where his skills would be welcomed and his experience valued. He could transfer to palace security in a more active role, using his expertise to prevent future attacks. Or he could remain with the Royal Guards, but with the understanding that his real background was now known and appreciated by his commanding officers. Marcus had chosen to stay with the Royal Guards, but his role had evolved far beyond ceremonial duties. He now helped train other guards in threat assessment and emergency response, sharing knowledge that could save lives without revealing the classified details of his past missions. He worked closely with Inspector Chen on security protocols, using his special forces experience to identify potential vulnerabilities and improve protective measures. The nightmares that had plagued Marcus for years began to change. Instead of reliving the faces of enemies he had killed in distant countries, he dreamed about the families he had saved, the children who had gone home safely to their parents, the elderly woman and young girl who had survived because he had been there when they needed protection. The weight of his past actions remained, but it was balanced now by the knowledge that his skills had been used to preserve innocent life rather than end it. Inspector Chen had become an unexpected friend, someone who understood the burden of violence in service of protecting others. She helped Marcus process the psychological impact of being forced back into combat, and she ensured that he received proper counseling and support for the trauma of having to take lives again after working so hard to leave that part of his past behind. The media attention gradually faded, as it always does, but Marcus found that he no longer needed to hide from who he really was. The integration of his SAS identity with his role as a royal guard created a sense of wholeness that he hadn't felt in years. He was still serving his country, still protecting innocent people, but now he could do so openly and with the full support of his colleagues and commanders. On quiet days, when the tourists were fewer and the palace grounds were peaceful, Marcus would sometimes think about the path that had brought him to this moment. The years of violence and trauma in the SAS, the desperate attempt to find peace through ceremonial service, the mockery and isolation he had endured, and finally the moment when all of his training had been needed to save lives rather than take them. Lieutenant Morrison approached Marcus one afternoon during a break, asking for advice about applying for Special Forces selection. The young officer had been inspired by Marcus's example and wanted to push himself to become a better soldier. Marcus shared what wisdom he could, emphasizing the importance of mental preparation and the weight of responsibility that came with elite training. The elderly woman and young girl whom Marcus had saved in the throne room visited the palace a month later, bringing flowers and a handwritten thank you letter. The grandmother told Marcus that she prayed for him every night, understanding that he had risked his own life to save theirs. The young girl, no longer paralyzed by fear, gave him a drawing she had made of a soldier protecting a castle. Marcus realized that redemption hadn't come from abandoning his past or hiding from his skills, but from using those abilities in service of something larger than himself. The quiet years as a royal guard hadn't been wasted time. They had been preparation for a moment when his unique combination of special forces training and protective instincts would be exactly what innocent people needed to survive. As evening fell and his shift ended. Marcus walked through the palace gardens where he had sat with Inspector Chen on the night of the attack. The peace he felt now was different from the hollow quiet he had sought when he first requested transfer to the Royal Guards. This was the peace of someone who had found balance between his warrior nature and his desire to protect rather than destroy. The transformation was complete. Marcus Thompson was no longer the silent, mocked guard who stood like a statue while tourists took pictures. He was no longer the guilt-ridden SAS operative trying to escape his past through ceremonial service. He had become something new, a protector who could use the deadliest skills in service of preserving life, a warrior who had found his true purpose not in distant battlefields, but in the heart of his own country. The tourists would continue to come to Buckingham Palace, and many would pose for pictures with the guards who stood watch over British tradition and ceremony. But they would never know that one of those guards had earned his quiet confidence through trials that most people could never imagine, and that his stillness came not from emptiness, but from the deep peace of someone who had finally found his place in the world.